The night air in Ohio carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, and I remember how small I felt beneath that wide country sky. I was born into simplicity, not greatness. My father ran a tannery, the work harsh and the smell of hides always clinging to his clothes. He was ambitious, always looking for ways to climb higher, to make his family respectable. My mother was quieter, steadier, the kind of woman whose silence carried more weight than words. Between them I grew, a boy shy to speak, a boy who preferred the company of horses to people. I was not loud, not commanding. I blended into the background. And yet in that quiet, the shape of my life was already forming. Horses were my gift. Before I could lift a tool, before I could read a book with ease, I could handle the wildest colt in our county. It wasn't strength alone that gave me that gift. It was patience. I learned that animals, like people, could not be broken by force without losing something essential. They had to be understood. With a steady hand and a calm presence, even the fiercest horse would eventually yield. That quiet mastery became my pride, though I never boasted of it. It was simply something I knew, something I could do, and as the years passed, it set me apart. I never imagined that skill would carry me beyond our small town. My father, however, saw further than I did. He pressed me toward West Point, the military academy that promised a life of discipline and opportunity. I resisted. I had no hunger for the soldier's life. The thought of war, of killing, weighed on me even as a child. But my father's persistence wore me down. He pushed and eventually I yielded. At 17, I set out for West Point, my heart heavy with doubt. My mind certain that I was walking a road not meant for me. The academy was rigid, demanding, and unforgiving. I was not a top student. Mathematics frustrated me, and I drifted to the bottom half of the class. But I endured. I kept my head down, found ways to survive the endless drills and the suffocating rules. Where others sought glory, I sought simply to pass each day without disgrace. They called me Ulysses there, a name the clerk mistakenly recorded instead of Hiram, the name I had been given. And so I became Ulysses S. Grant, as if the world had decided to remake me before I had proven myself. I carried that name like a cloak I had not chosen, and in time, it became the only one I knew. Graduation came without celebration in my heart. I left West Point with middling marks, no remarkable rank, and little sense of purpose. I did not imagine that greatness awaited me. I saw instead a life of quiet postings, of doing my duty and fading into obscurity. I thought often of horses, of the simplicity of home, of a life that might have been. But fate had other plans, and though I did not seek them, I would find myself again and again at the heart of storms, larger than I could comprehend. The first storm came in Mexico. I wore the uniform, rode under generals whose names would later shape history, and I saw the brutality of war with my own eyes. I fought because I was ordered to, because duty bound me. Yet even as I carried out commands, something inside me recoiled at the slaughter, at the waste of human life. I admired Zachary Taylor's calm simplicity, his refusal to dress himself in pomp, and I studied Winfield Scott's precision, his ability to move armies like chess pieces. From them I learned lessons that would return to me in darker days. But in Mexico I also learned that I did not love war. I hated it. I saw valor, yes, but also cruelty. I saw ambition drive men to sacrifice others for glory. I felt the futility of conquest, of taking land only to fill it with grief. When I returned home, the uniform no longer felt like mine. I resigned my commission not in disgrace but in quiet surrender. I chose family over fame, obscurity over the parade ground. I sought to build a life as a farmer, a store clerk, whatever honest work I could find, but failure clung to me. Crops withered, businesses faltered, debts piled. The whispers of drink followed me, and I carried shame heavier than any weapon I had lifted in Mexico. For years I drifted in anonymity, a man who seemed destined for nothing. And yet in the stillness of those years I learned humility. I learned the bitterness of disappointment, the sting of falling short, the quiet dignity of endurance. These were lessons no academy had taught me, no general had drilled into me. They were the lessons of life, harsh but necessary. When I walked the fields at dusk, the world silent, but for the sound of my boots and the whisper of wind through the trees, I wondered if this was all I would ever be. A forgotten soldier, a failed farmer, a husband trying to provide what he could with too little. And for a long time I believed that was true. But history has a way of finding the reluctant. It does not always call the ambitious, the loud, or the eager. Sometimes it seeks out the quiet, the overlooked, the ones who have known failure and carry humility like a scar. I did not know it then, but the storms that would define me had not yet come. I had only seen the edges of them. And when they broke, they would test every lesson I had learned in silence, every ounce of patience I had gained in failure, every measure of calm I had practiced since the days I first held the reins of a frightened horse. That was the beginning. Not of glory, not of triumph, but of a man shaped by quietness and struggle, waiting without knowing for history's call. The heat of Mexico clung to everything. Dust rose with every step, settling in our clothes, our lungs, our thoughts. I was a young officer then, barely seasoned, carrying the weight of expectation without the confidence to match it. My orders were simple: serve, obey, endure. Yet nothing about that war felt simple. I watched men march under banners, proud and eager, only to collapse under the weight of sun and hunger before they ever saw an enemy. Disease took more than bullets, and the camp stank of sickness, fear, and resignation. Under General Zachary Taylor, I saw a kind of leadership that surprised me. He was not a man of polish or grandeur. He dressed plainly, carried himself without theatrics, and yet his men trusted him. They fought because they believed he understood them, because he seemed part of them rather than above them. I studied him quietly, noting that strength was not in appearance, but in consistency, in the way a man stood firm when the storm rose. Later, under Winfield Scott, I saw the opposite: precision, calculation. A general who thought of war as a grand design, each regiment a piece on his chessboard. Scott's brilliance was undeniable, but it was cold, detached. Between these two men, I learned what I would one day need: that leadership was neither one style nor the other, but a balance of closeness and distance, humanity and strategy. The battles were fierce. At Palo Alto, Resaca de la Palma, Monterrey, Buena Vista. Names that meant little to me before became etched in my memory in blood. I carried dispatches, rode into danger, saw comrades torn apart by cannon fire. At Molino del Rey and Chapultepec, I climbed walls under fire, led men through chaos that seemed endless. Medals and commendations came, but they felt hollow. Each one reminded me not of glory, but of faces lost, voices silenced. The war revealed something darker, too. It was not fought only for honor or defense. It was fought for ambition, for expansion, for the hunger of a nation that believed its destiny lay across every mountain and desert. I saw officers thirsting for reputation, politicians thirsting for land, and men on both sides paying the price. I wrote in letters then that the war was unjust, that it was driven by greed rather than necessity. I believed it, even as I carried out orders, even as I fired shots. That contradiction lived in me, a wound deeper than any physical scar. And yet, I could not deny the skill it forced me to develop. I learned logistics, how to move supplies through wilderness, how to feed an army when there was nothing around to take. I learned to read terrain, to see how rivers, hills, and roads shaped victory or defeat. I learned to keep calm under fire, to make decisions when hesitation would mean death. Those lessons stayed with me, even when I wanted to leave the uniform behind. When the war ended, parades and celebrations erupted back home. Generals basked in triumph. Politicians boasted of victories. I felt only unease. I had seen the price, the waste, the suffering. Mexico had not been liberated. It had been taken. The land we claimed was vast, yes, but it was bought with blood that could never be returned. For me, the war ended not in pride, but in doubt. I returned to garrison duty, drifting between postings. California, the Pacific Northwest, remote outposts where isolation gnawed at the mind. There were whispers about me, about drink, about weakness. Some were true, some exaggerated, but the weight of them pressed down all the same. I did not thrive in peacetime. I was restless, uncertain, disconnected. Finally, I resigned my commission. Quietly, without fanfare, I walked away from the army. Civilian life greeted me harshly. Farming failed, ventures collapsed, business partnerships dissolved. More than once I returned to my father's store, humiliated to take wages at a counter after years in uniform. The world looked at me and saw a man of no consequence, a former officer who had squandered his chance, a husband and father who could barely provide. And I believed it too at times. I felt as though I had already lived the most important moments of my life in the dust and blood of Mexico, and that nothing more awaited me. But history is strange. It often calls upon those least expecting it, those who have already resigned themselves to smallness. The lessons I carried from Mexico, patience under fire, clarity amid chaos, the knowledge that war is not glory but endurance, and they lingered inside me. They waited, buried beneath years of failure, until the day they would be needed again. And when that call finally came, it would not be in the deserts of a foreign land but in the fields, rivers, and towns of my own country torn apart by a conflict far greater, far bloodier, far more decisive than anything Mexico had shown me. When I left the army, I thought the chapter of my life that mattered most had closed. The uniform no longer sat on my shoulders, the sword no longer hung at my side, and the rhythm of military life faded into memory. I walked away believing that whatever future awaited me, it would be small, ordinary, perhaps even invisible. What I did not expect was how heavy failure can feel when it comes not from battle but from the daily struggle to survive. I tried farming first. My father-in-law, Julia's father, gave us land near St. Louis, and I bent my back to the soil. I rose with the sun, labored with the plow, pushed myself to believe that honest work could carve out a stable life for my family. But the earth did not reward me. Seasons turned, crops failed, debts crept higher, and each harvest brought disappointment instead of relief. Farming is patience, but it is also chance, and chance rarely favored me in those years. I watched other men prosper while I sank deeper into uncertainty. With the farm failing, I turned to other work. I cut wood, hauled it to town, sold it by the wagon load. My hands blistered, the axe wore me down, and yet the coins I earned felt too small for the effort. Pride slipped away with each swing. There had been a time when I had carried dispatches under fire, when cannon blasts had shaken the ground beneath me, when decisions I made had meant life or death. Now I sold firewood by the bundle, bargaining with townsfolk over pennies, pretending not to hear the pity or the disdain in their voices. I tried business too. I partnered with acquaintances, attempted to sell goods, and manage trade. Each attempt crumbled, undone by bad timing, poor management, or simple misfortune. Failure followed me like a shadow. I felt as though every venture I touched soured in my hands, as if destiny had turned its back on me. I did not chase wealth for glory. I chased it because I had a family to feed, children to raise, a wife who believed in me, even when I struggled to believe in myself. The whispers about me grew. Some said I drank too much, that I drowned my failures in the bottle. There is truth in that, though not as much as was claimed. Drink was never my companion in triumph, but my refuge in despair. When the farm failed, when businesses collapsed, when debts weighed heavy, I sought relief in the haze of alcohol. But it never solved anything. It left me emptier, more ashamed. I knew it, and still I returned to it in weakness. The rumors clung to me, staining my reputation, following me long after those years had ended. Through it all, Julia stood by me. Her patience was a gift I never deserved. She came from a family of stature, a family that might have expected their daughter to marry a man of influence or wealth. Instead, she tied her life to mine, a man stumbling from failure to failure, scraping by on meager earnings. Yet she never abandoned me, never faltered in her belief that I carried something within me worth enduring for. Her love was a constant, the one light that steadied me through the dimmest years. At last, defeated by farming, beaten by business, I returned to my father's store in Galena, Illinois. Imagine the humiliation. A former officer of the United States Army, a man who had once served under Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, now weighing out leather, tallying up bills, and earning wages as a clerk behind his father's counter. Customers who knew my past looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and pity, as if wondering how far a man could fall. And I wondered too. I stood behind that counter and asked myself whether this was all my life would ever be. At night, after the store closed, I would walk the streets of Galena. The lamps glowed dimly, the air cool against my face. My thoughts wandered back to Mexico, the battles I had despised yet endured. The sound of musket fire, the smoke of cannon, the cries of the wounded. They returned to me in memory, not with pride but with clarity. In war, I had known my place, however much I hated it. I had carried orders, made decisions, acted with purpose. There had been no question of what I was meant to do, but in peace I was adrift, a man without direction, a soldier without a war. Those years of obscurity stretched long, and each one pressed me deeper into quiet resignation. I began to believe that the name Ulysses S. Grant would never mean more than a line in a county ledger or a forgotten grave in a small Ohio town. I had no illusions of greatness, no dreams of legacy. I lived day to day, earning enough to provide what little I could, carrying the silent ache of wasted potential. And yet, failure taught me something no academy ever had, no general ever drilled into me. It taught me patience, not the patience of waiting for crops to grow or for customers to enter a shop, but the patience to endure shame, to endure obscurity, to endure the quiet erosion of one's pride, without surrendering entirely. It taught me humility, a humility I had not carried in Mexico. I had known victory then, commendations, recognition. But in Galena there were no medals, no parades, only the steady grind of survival. And I endured it. I did not know it at the time, but those years of failure were shaping me into something different. They stripped me of ambition, burned away any hunger for glory. By the time the cannons fired at Fort Sumter and the Union fractured, I was no longer a young officer chasing rank. I was a man who understood loss, who understood endurance, who had been tested not by the roar of battle, but by the slow, suffocating weight of disappointment. When war came, it came suddenly. News of Fort Sumter spread like wildfire, and the nation split apart. Men rushed to enlist, governors scrambled for officers, and the army, desperate and unprepared, reached for anyone with training. My name surfaced not because I was remembered fondly, but because the country had need of men who had once worn the uniform. Reluctantly, cautiously, I was drawn back into service. I did not return to the ranks as the man I had been in Mexico. That young officer had doubted himself, sought competence, feared failure. This man, hardened by years of defeat, no longer cared for ambition or reputation. I carried no illusions. I returned because duty demanded it, because when your country fractures, you cannot stand aside. You step forward even if you believe yourself unworthy. I put on the blue uniform again, the cloth heavy with memory, the sword once more at my side. The quiet clerk from Galena had been forgotten by the world, but the world would remember me soon enough. All the years of insignificance, all the failures, all the whispers of shame. They had prepared me, though I did not yet understand it. The battles ahead would be greater than anything I had faced in Mexico, greater than anything I had imagined. And I was ready, not because I sought them, but because life had taught me to endure. Those who had never failed could not have endured what was coming, but I had. And in that endurance lay the strength that history would one day demand of me. The first cannon shot at Fort Sumter rolled across the nation like thunder, shaking every home, every street, every heart. In Galena, where I stood behind my father's counter, the news hit with force I could not ignore. The country had split, brothers now enemies, states declaring independence from the union I had once sworn to defend. I was not a politician, not a man of speeches or grand ideals, but I understood one thing with clarity. The Union must not fall. That conviction burned quietly, steadily, and it pulled me back into the world I thought I had left behind. At first I offered my help in simple ways. I drilled volunteers, townsmen who had never held a rifle before, teaching them the basics of formation, of discipline, of survival on a battlefield. They looked to me not because I had sought leadership, but because I had experience. My years at West Point, my service in Mexico, forgotten by most, suddenly mattered again. I had worn the uniform, and in a country tearing itself apart, that was enough to make me useful. In June 1861, the governor of Illinois gave me a command, a regiment of men green as spring wheat. I trained them, marched them, prepared them as best I could. I was not charismatic, not inspiring in words, but I was steady. I led not with flourishes, but with action, and the men responded. They knew I would not ask of them what I would not do myself. And when the time came to march into Missouri, to confront Confederate forces, I carried with me the calm certainty I had learned in years of obscurity. Do your duty, endure, press forward. The first taste of battle in this new war came at Belmont in November. It was a small fight by later standards, chaotic and bloody, but it gave me my first real command in combat. We attacked, overran Confederate positions, burned their camp, only to be counterattacked and forced into retreat. I held the line, rallied my men, and brought them back across the river under fire. It was no clear victory, yet it was no defeat either. What mattered was that the men had fought, had stood their ground, had learned they could face the enemy and survive. I learned something too. Hesitation kills. Decisions, even imperfect ones, must be made swiftly. That truth would guide me in every battle to come. The war demanded more, always more. In early 1862, I led an expedition against Fort Henry on the Tennessee River. The attack was supported by gunboats, and when the fort fell quickly, I saw how rivers and supply lines could be the arteries of victory. But it was the next step, Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River, that would change everything. The Confederates fought hard, the winter cold biting through uniforms, the ground frozen beneath our boots. When their commanders sought terms of surrender, I refused half measures. I demanded nothing less than unconditional surrender. Those words, printed in newspapers across the North, gave me a reputation I had never sought. The public called me Unconditional Surrender Grant, a name that would follow me forever. I had become, almost overnight, a symbol of determination, of resolve, of the will to see the war through without compromise. The victories at Henry and Donelson lifted Union morale and opened rivers that split the Confederacy. For the first time, the North tasted real momentum. I, a man who had once sold firewood by the roadside, now found myself in command of thousands, entrusted with the fate of campaigns that stretched across entire states. It was a weight I did not take lightly, but it did not intimidate me. I had known failure, I had known despair. War was brutal, but it was clear the objective was simple: defeat the enemy. Then came Shiloh, April 1862. The fields of Tennessee, quiet at first, exploded in violence. The Confederates struck at dawn, their assault fierce and unexpected. My men were driven back, camps overrun, the air thick with smoke and screams. For hours, chaos reigned. Officers fell, soldiers fled, the line teetered on the edge of collapse. I was caught in the storm, riding from one shattered position to another, rallying men, holding fragments of the army together. The ground turned red with blood. The sun rose and fell on carnage beyond imagining. When reinforcements arrived and the tide turned, we counterattacked and drove the enemy back. 2 days of slaughter ended with the field in our hands, but at a cost so terrible, it haunted me for the rest of my life. More than 20,000 casualties littered the ground, men dead, wounded, or missing. Shiloh was not a triumph. It was a grim revelation. The war would not be quick, would not be glorious. It would be long, bloody, and merciless. And I, who hated war, now knew I was bound to fight it to the end. The critics descended on me after Shiloh. They said I had been careless, unprepared, reckless with lives. Newspapers demanded my removal. Politicians called for my resignation. But I remained, shielded in part by President Lincoln, who said simply, "I can't spare this man. He fights." That defense mattered more than any headline. It told me that someone in Washington understood what I was willing to endure, and it steeled me further. Between Donelson and Shiloh, I began to see my reputation grow in ways I never expected. Soldiers trusted me. They knew I was calm under fire. that I would not abandon them. I did not deliver grand speeches. I did not strut in polished boots. I walked among them, plain and steady, and they felt I was one of their own. My authority came not from words, but from action, from presence. That bond forged in blood and mud would carry us through many storms yet to come. As the months passed, I looked at maps of rivers and railroads, of forts and supply depots, and I saw patterns others missed. The Confederacy could not be beaten in one blow. It had to be strangled, cut apart, starved of its lifelines. I thought of the lessons from Mexico, of how terrain shaped outcomes, how supply dictated strength. I applied those lessons ruthlessly. Each river taken was a vein severed. Each fort captured was a step closer to the heart. Yet through it all, I never sought glory. I carried no illusions of being a great man, no hunger for headlines. I fought because the war demanded it, because the Union demanded it, because the alternative, a fractured nation, a broken republic, was unacceptable. My past failures gave me a strange calm. I did not fear disgrace, for I had lived it already. I did not fear obscurity, for I had endured it. What I feared was only defeat, the loss of the Union, the unraveling of everything the country had been built upon. That fear drove me harder than ambition ever could. By the end of 1862, I was no longer the forgotten clerk from Galena. I was a general of consequence, my name carried in newspapers across the nation, my reputation debated in Congress and in taverns alike. Some saw me as reckless, others as relentless, but none could deny that I fought and that I won. And yet I knew that what lay ahead would be even darker. Shiloh had shown me the scale of suffering that awaited, and I carried its memory like a weight I could never set down. I thought often of the men who had fallen, their faces, their cries, their silence. I had seen death before, but not like that, not in such numbers. I hated war more deeply than ever, but I had also accepted that I was bound to it until the end. The Civil War had drawn me back into the uniform, not by choice, but by necessity. I was no longer the obscure farmer, the failed businessman, the forgotten soldier. I was Ulysses S. Grant, though I had not yet embraced the full measure of that name. History had taken me from the shadows and placed me at the center of its storm, and though I did not seek it, I knew I could not turn away. The road ahead stretched long, through sieges and marches, through victories and losses, through more blood than I dared to imagine. I would endure it as I had endured everything before, quietly, steadily, relentlessly. Because in war, as in life, I had learned one truth above all: to hesitate is to fail. And I would not fail. Not while the Union still stood, not while there was breath in my body, not while the fate of the nation rested in my hands. The Mississippi River stretched wide and powerful, a lifeline that cut through the continent and carried with it the fate of the war. Whoever controlled it would control the very heart of America. For the Confederacy, it was the artery that bound east to west, that carried supplies, men, and hope. For the Union, it was the key to splitting the South in two and choking off its strength. I understood this with clarity, perhaps more than most. Every map I studied, every report I read told me the same truth: the river must be ours, and the fortress city that held it, Vicksburg, would have to fall. Vicksburg was no ordinary city. Perched on high bluffs, ringed with defenses, it was a citadel commanding the river with iron will. To capture it would be no simple strike, no quick maneuver. It would require patience, endurance, and the kind of determination that could withstand not days, not weeks, but months of relentless struggle. When I set my mind to that campaign, I knew it would test me in ways nothing yet had. We tried first by direct assault, striking hard to break through the defenses. The ground was unforgiving. The Confederates dug in deep, their artillery sweeping the approaches with fire. My men fought bravely, climbed slopes under storms of bullets, but the works held firm. Twice we hurled ourselves at the defenses, and twice we were repelled with heavy loss. Critics later would call those attacks reckless, cruel even, but I had to know the measure of the enemy, the strength of their resolve. I had to learn through blood what maps and reports could not tell me. When the assaults failed, I shifted to what I knew best: persistence. I encircled the city, cut off its supplies, and tightened the noose with every passing day. We dug trenches, built batteries, tunneled beneath the earth, creeping closer, inch by inch. The siege began in May of 1863, and with it came the slow, grinding test of endurance. Inside the city, civilians and soldiers alike suffered hunger, disease, despair. They dug caves into the hillsides to escape bombardment, ate whatever scraps they could find, endured the steady roar of cannon that never ceased. Outside the walls, my men endured too. The Mississippi heat beat down, the air thick with insects, rations thin, disease spreading through the camps. Yet we held the line unbroken, knowing that time itself was our ally. Each day I walked the trenches, spoke little but watched everything. I had no need to give fiery speeches. The men saw me there, steady, unshaken, enduring the same heat, the same dangers. That presence mattered more than words. They knew I would not abandon the siege, would not falter, would not accept anything less than victory. As the weeks stretched into months, pressure mounted. Politicians in Washington doubted me, newspapers questioned me, rivals whispered that I was reckless, that I was wasting lives and time. But I ignored them. I had learned long ago, at Donelson and at Shiloh, that hesitation was the true enemy. I trusted my judgment, trusted my men, and pressed forward with grim resolve. On July 4th, 1863, the fortress broke. After 47 days of siege, the Confederate commander, Pemberton, surrendered his army of more than 30,000 men. The city fell, the river opened, and the Confederacy was cleaved in two. News of the surrender reached Washington alongside word of Gettysburg, another great Union victory in the East. Together they marked a turning point in the war, a moment when hope shifted decisively to our side. For me, Vicksburg was the proof of everything I had endured, everything I had believed. Persistence had triumphed where impatience would have failed. That was the day the nation truly knew my name. Ulysses S. Grant, once the obscure clerk in Galena, once the failed farmer, now stood as the general who had delivered the Mississippi to the Union. My reputation rose like a flood. The newspapers called me a hero, the people celebrated me, and in Washington voices began to whisper that I was the man who could end the war. I had not sought fame, but it came to me regardless, carried on the smoke of cannon and the blood of sieges. Vicksburg revealed to the world what I had long carried inside, that war is not won by brilliance alone, but by endurance, by patience, by the willingness to press forward when others falter. It showed that I would not yield, would not compromise, would not stop until the objective was in hand. That quality, more than any tactic or strategy, defined me. I stood on the bluffs after the surrender, looked out over the river flowing wide and free, and felt no triumph, only the heavy silence of victory. The cost had been immense, lives lost, families shattered, suffering etched into the land. Yet I knew it had been necessary. The Union could not survive divided, and Vicksburg had been the key. It was after Vicksburg that my identity, hidden until then in obscurity and failure, became undeniable. I was Ulysses S. Grant, and the fate of the Union was now bound to my name. History had claimed me, and I could no longer retreat into silence. The war had more storms to unleash, and I would be at their center, not because I desired it, but because destiny had left me no choice. When Vicksburg fell, I felt the burden of the war shift squarely onto my shoulders. The victory had elevated me beyond the Western theater. No longer was I simply the commander of a campaign along the rivers. Now I was seen as the Union's hope, the general who might finally end the conflict. The eyes of the nation turned toward me, and soon enough President Lincoln placed the full weight of command into my hands. I was made general-in-chief, entrusted with the vast armies of the United States, tasked with breaking the rebellion once and for all. It was not a title I had ever sought, but once it was given, I carried it with the same determination I had carried every other duty. The challenge ahead was immense. The Confederacy still stood strong, and Robert E. Lee, its most celebrated general, held firm in Virginia, defeating Union generals one after another. The Army of the Potomac had bled on fields from Bull Run to Fredericksburg to Chancellorsville, always falling short of decisive victory. Morale was low, politics ran hot, and every failure brought fresh doubt in Washington. I knew that if the war were to end, it would end in Virginia. To finish it, I would have to bring Lee to battle, and I would have to do what no other Union general had yet managed: break him. I took the field alongside the Army of the Potomac in the spring of 1864. George Meade, its commander, retained his position, but the ultimate responsibility was mine. The plan was simple in vision, but brutal in execution. Engage Lee directly, press him without pause, and grind down his army until it could fight no more. Other campaigns would strike across the South: Sherman in Georgia, others in the Shenandoah and the Trans-Mississippi. But the hammer would fall in Virginia. We crossed the Rapidan River and plunged into the tangled wilderness of scrub and undergrowth that gave the coming battle its name. The Wilderness, May 1864. Smoke hung thick, flames caught in the brush, men fought at close quarters where visibility was measured in feet. The forest itself became an enemy, trapping the wounded in fire, swallowing the sound of commands. For 2 days carnage reigned, and neither side could claim clear victory. In the past, Union armies, battered and bloodied, would have retreated northward, but I did not retreat. On the night of the second day, instead of turning back, I ordered the army to march southward, still pressing toward Richmond. When the men realized we were advancing, not retreating, cheers erupted along the lines. They understood what it meant. This campaign would not end until the war itself ended. From the Wilderness, we moved to Spotsylvania, where for nearly 2 weeks we battered against Lee's entrenched lines. The fighting was savage, hand to hand at places like the Bloody Angle, where men clawed and struck at each other over earthworks turned slick with blood. Thousands fell, and still we pressed forward. When Spotsylvania ended, we marched again, not back, but onward, always onward. Cold Harbor followed, another brutal clash where assaults against fortified works cost us dearly. Critics called me a butcher, said I spent men's lives recklessly. I carried those losses heavily, more than anyone will ever know. Each name, each regiment, each report of the dead was a weight added to my conscience. But I believed, with grim certainty, that this relentless pressure was the only way to end the rebellion. We crossed the James River and laid siege to Petersburg, the rail hub that fed Richmond. For months the fighting dragged on, trench lines spreading like scars across the land, foreshadowing wars of the future. It was grinding, merciless work, but slowly, steadily we tightened the stranglehold. Supplies dwindled for Lee's army, his men starving, his lines stretched thin. Still he fought with brilliance and stubbornness, refusing to yield, prolonging the war through sheer determination. Through it all, I kept my focus. I rarely raised my voice, rarely gave in to despair. I smoked my cigars, rode the lines, spoke little but observed much. My calm steadiness was my strength, even when inside I carried the unbearable weight of thousands of dead and wounded. I knew that if I faltered, if I hesitated, the war would drag on for years more, costing lives in numbers I could not imagine. The only mercy I could offer was to end it as swiftly as possible, even if the way to that end was lined with graves. By the spring of 1865, the noose was closing. Sherman had marched through Georgia, breaking the Confederacy's heartland. In Virginia, our siege finally cracked the defenses at Petersburg, and Lee abandoned Richmond. We pursued him westward, mile after mile, his army shrinking with every step, until at last he halted at Appomattox courthouse. There, on April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. I rode to meet him in the McLean house, nervous despite myself. He arrived immaculate in full uniform, sword at his side. I wore my simple private's coat, mud still on my boots, my appearance plain and unadorned. We spoke quietly, respectfully. There was no triumph in me, no hunger to humiliate. I remembered Mexico. I remembered the bitterness of defeat, and I knew that mercy was as vital as victory. I offered generous terms. The Confederates would lay down their arms, return home, and be left in peace so long as they observed the laws. Lee accepted, his dignity intact, his men spared needless suffering. When word spread, cheers and celebrations erupted. But I felt only relief. Relief that the slaughter was ending, that the rivers of blood might at last run dry. I thought of Lincoln, of his words that the Union must be saved with malice toward none, with charity for all. I tried to honor that spirit in the surrender, to make the first step toward healing a nation torn apart. The war had demanded everything of me. It had tested me in fire and blood, pushed me beyond the man who had once clerked in his father's store, beyond the failures and humiliations that had once defined me. Now I stood as the general who had brought the Union to victory. The newspapers hailed me, the people celebrated me, and history etched my name alongside the nation's survival. Yet inside I carried not triumph, but scars. I hated war as much as ever, perhaps more. I had seen too much death, too much suffering, too much loss. But I had also seen what endurance, persistence, and relentless resolve could achieve. The Union still stood. The Republic had survived. And though my part in the story was not yet over, I knew that in those years of command, I had done what I was meant to do. The quiet man who once blended into the background, who once failed at farming and business, had shouldered the burden of the nation's survival. And though I wore no airs of glory, I understood that history had bound my name forever to the saving of the Union. When the guns at Appomattox fell silent, I thought I might finally lay down the burden that had grown so heavy across 4 long years. My mind turned toward peace, toward quiet days with Julia and the children, toward a life where blood no longer stained my hands. Yet the truth was that peace was never simple, never whole. The Union had survived, but the wounds were deep and jagged, and they would not close easily. I did not seek power beyond the battlefield, but power sought me. The people, hungry for stability, looked at me and saw not a politician, not a statesman, but a man who had endured, who had carried the weight of victory. They wanted me to lead again, and though my heart longed for rest, I could not refuse. The South was broken, its fields burned, its cities gutted, its people divided between surrender and bitterness. Freedmen walked newly into the sunlight of liberty, but their freedom was fragile, contested at every turn. The North, though victorious, was weary, impatient, and eager to move forward. Politicians quarreled over Reconstruction, voices rising in Congress like cannon fire in a chambered hall. Some wanted mercy, others demanded punishment, and the line between justice and vengeance grew thin. Into that storm I was drawn, silent as ever, reluctant as always, yet bound by duty. When the Republican Party nominated me in 1868, I accepted not out of ambition, but out of obligation. I had been called before and I had answered. Now I was called again, and again I would answer. My campaign was simple, built not on promises, but on trust, not on elaborate speeches, but on a single phrase that echoed across the country. Let us have peace. The people wanted nothing more, and they believed I could deliver it. The election was decisive. I, Ulysses S. Grant, once a clerk in Galena, once a failed farmer, now stood as the 18th President of the United States. The oath of office felt heavier than any sword I had carried. Washington bustled with celebration. Banners unfurled, crowds roared, yet inside me there was only a quiet resolve. I had not sought this honor, but it was mine nonetheless. The country was now my battlefield, and though no musket fired, though no cannon roared, the stakes were as high as any I had known. I told myself I would govern as I had commanded. Steadily, honestly, without flourish, with the determination to see the task through. But I learned quickly that politics was not war. On the battlefield, the enemy wore gray and fired from across the line. In Washington, the enemy wore smiles, whispered promises, and cloaked betrayal in courtesy. I trusted too easily. Men I appointed to high office, men I believed to be honest, proved corrupt, greedy, unworthy. The scandals that erupted, the whiskey ring, the Indian trading posts, the schemes of men who used my trust for their gain, stained my presidency like mud on a soldier's coat. Critics said I was naive, blind, unfit for the complexities of politics. Perhaps they were right. But I will tell you this: I never stole, I never schemed, I never sought to profit. My failure was not dishonesty, but trust. I believed too much in men who did not deserve it. Still, there were victories, and they mattered. The hate group spread terror in the South, riding under hoods, burning homes, killing freedmen who dared to claim their rights. I sent federal troops to break them, signed laws to crush their power, and for a time, we succeeded. The 15th Amendment passed, enshrining the right to vote regardless of race. Black men cast ballots, served in legislatures, held office. It was fragile, it was contested, but it was real. A spark of equality that had never before burned in our land. I was proud of that. Proud that in my presidency, the promise of freedom became more than words. But peace proved elusive. The panic of 1873 struck, and with it came despair. Banks failed, railroads collapsed, men stood in bread lines, and families starved. The prosperity that victory had promised dissolved into hardship. And though I fought to restore confidence, the blame fell upon me. The people who had once cheered my name now cursed it. They said the soldier had been strong in war but weak in peace. They said my victories were behind me. Each newspaper that carried those words was like a fresh wound, yet I bore them silently, as I always had. There were moments of quiet success. We resolved disputes with Britain through the Treaty of Washington, proving that peace could be won not only by force, but by diplomacy. We expanded trade, strengthened the army, and held the Union together when it might have splintered again. Yet scandals always shouted louder than successes, and by the end of my second term, my name was as often spoken in disappointment as in praise. Still, I did not waver. I remained steady, as I had in every storm. I did not seek to dazzle or charm, only to endure. My critics called me silent, dull, plodding. Perhaps I was. But I will tell you this: silence has its own strength. I did not need to speak often. I needed only to act. And when it came to the great questions of my time, the survival of the Union, the rights of freedmen, the pursuit of peace, I acted with conviction. I remember walking through the White House late at night, the halls quiet, portraits of past presidents watching from their frames. I thought often of Washington, who had carried the burden of being first. I thought of Lincoln, whose voice had steadied a nation even as his life was cut short. I did not compare myself to them, for their greatness was of a different kind. But I told myself that in my own way, with my plainness, my persistence, my stubborn refusal to yield, I too had served the Republic. The years of my presidency wore me down. By 1877, when I stepped aside, I felt older than my age, my face lined, my body weary. I was relieved to go, to lay aside the burden. Yet, as I left, I wondered what history would say. Would it remember Vicksburg and Appomattox? Or would it remember only the scandals and failures? Would it see a man who had preserved freedom for millions, or a man too trusting to guard against betrayal? And here is where the truth of my story lies. History does not belong to those who seek perfection, but to those who endure. I had endured obscurity, failure, war, scandal, criticism. I had endured and I had carried the nation forward, even if imperfectly. That is what I gave, and that is what I left behind. I did not wear the presidency with brilliance, but I wore it with honesty. I did not shine, but I stood firm. I did not inspire with words, but I acted with conviction. And though my years in office brought as much disappointment as triumph, I will tell you this: I remained true. I remained steady. I remained myself. That more than anything was my strength. And that is why, even in the darkest nights of my presidency, when scandals swirled and critics howled, I never doubted this: the Union endured, Freedom expanded, and the Republic survived. For that, I would bear any wound, endure any criticism, carry any burden. Because in the end, endurance is victory. The presidency was unlike any battlefield I had ever known. In war, the enemy stood before you, clear and armed, his intentions unmasked. In politics, the enemy hid in shadows, cloaked betrayal in friendship, and wielded whispers as weapons sharper than any blade. I entered office determined to govern as I had commanded, plainly, honestly, with steady persistence. But politics is a mire, and even the surest step can sink unexpectedly. Reconstruction weighed on me above all. The war had ended, but its scars were fresh, bleeding still in every southern town and every freedman's face. Millions of men, women, and children who had once been enslaved now walked in the uncertain light of liberty. I felt the weight of their future on my shoulders. It was not enough that chains had been struck off. Freedom must mean protection, rights, and dignity. I pressed Congress to pass laws, deployed federal troops to protect elections, and sent the might of the government against the Ku Klux Klan, whose midnight riders spread fear and death across the South. For a time, we broke them, scattered their strength, and gave space for black men to cast votes, hold office, and claim the promise of citizenship. That fight was one of the proudest battles of my presidency, though I knew even then how fragile it remained. Still, corruption whispered through the halls of government. I trusted men who seemed honest, gave office to those I believed loyal, and too often they betrayed me. The Credit Mobilier scandal tainted Congress. The whiskey ring siphoned taxes meant for the nation, and though I never profited, my administration was stained by association. Critics called me blind, said I was naive, said the general who had seen through fog and smoke on the battlefield could not see deception when it wore a smile. They were not entirely wrong. My weakness was not dishonesty, but trust. Trust placed in the unworthy, faith given too freely. Each revelation cut me deeply, not because it endangered me, but because it wounded the nation I had sworn to serve. The Panic of 1873 brought another storm. Railroads collapsed, banks closed, and families lost everything. Crowds filled the streets in despair. Workers demanded relief, and the promise of prosperity dissolved overnight. I tried to stabilize the economy, held firm to the gold standard, resisted easy solutions that might have doomed the future. But hardship endured, and the people, impatient and hurting, turned their frustration toward me. For all my efforts, I could not ease the suffering quickly enough, and the years of my presidency became synonymous with depression and unrest. Yet not all was shadow. Abroad we settled claims with Britain through the Treaty of Washington, a triumph of diplomacy rather than war. No battles were fought, no lives lost, yet respect was won and peace secured. At home, despite resistance, the 15th Amendment was ratified, enshrining the right to vote regardless of race. I signed it with solemn pride, knowing it was a promise worth defending, even if its fulfillment would take generations. Through every storm, I remained steady. I was never eloquent, never polished, never a master of rhetoric. But I was unshaken. I did not panic in the face of scandal, did not waver under criticism, did not abandon the cause of Reconstruction, even when the nation's appetite waned. My critics called me silent, stubborn, unrefined. Perhaps I was. But I believed then, as I believe now, that endurance itself is a kind of strength. As my second term drew to an end, I felt the weight of the years pressing on me. I had carried the nation through war, carried it again through fragile peace, and though my presidency was scarred by scandal and marred by economic despair, I had not yielded. I had tried to hold firm to honesty in a world that prized cunning, to steadiness in a capital that thrived on intrigue. History would judge me harshly, I knew, but history would also remember that I had stood. When I left office in 1877, I walked away with relief, but also with doubt. Had I done enough for the freedmen whose rights were already under siege? Had I fought corruption hard enough, chosen men wisely enough, pressed forward strongly enough? These questions lingered, unanswered, as I stepped from the White House into the uncertain quiet of private life. Yet I told myself one truth to silence the doubt. I had served as best I knew how, with the same persistence that had carried me at Vicksburg and Appomattox. The presidency had not been a triumphal march. It had been a siege, long and grueling, filled with both victory and disappointment. And though it left scars on my reputation, I carried it as I had carried every burden, without flourish, without complaint, with endurance until the end. When I left the White House in 1877, I believed, perhaps naively, that the burdens of public life were behind me. I had endured the fire of war and the storms of politics, and now I hoped to find rest in the quiet dignity of private life. Julia and I traveled, welcomed in cities across the country, greeted by crowds who still remembered the general, even if they had grown weary of the president. For a time there was peace, and I allowed myself to believe that my story might close gently. But peace, I discovered, is often brief, and life has a way of testing even the weary once more. Not long after leaving office, I was persuaded into ventures that promised prosperity. Friends and financiers spoke of opportunities, of investments, of enterprises that would secure the Grant family's future. I trusted too easily, as I always had. I placed my name, my honor, and my confidence into the hands of men who assured me they would act with integrity. But integrity is rare in the world of money, and betrayal came swiftly. A partnership I entered collapsed in scandal. My fortune vanished overnight, and debts mounted to sums I could never hope to repay. Newspapers that had once printed my victories now carried the shame of my financial ruin. I, the general who had commanded armies, the president who had governed a nation, found myself penniless, humiliated, and burdened with obligations I could not escape. I might have been crushed entirely had it not been for one final act of endurance. Samuel Clemens, known to the world as Mark Twain, came to me then. He saw not a fallen man, but a story that still mattered, a voice that still carried weight. He urged me to write my memoirs, to tell the story of my life in my own words, to preserve my legacy and secure a future for Julia and the children. At first I hesitated. I was no writer. I had never loved words as Lincoln had, never turned phrases like a statesman. But I understood one truth. I had lived through moments that must not be forgotten. And so I began to write. The work consumed me. Day after day, I sat with pen in hand, recalling battles, marches, councils, and decisions that had shaped the fate of the Union. I wrote plainly without flourish as I had always spoken. I told of Donelson, of Shiloh, of Vicksburg, of Appomattox. I told of Lincoln, of the men who had fought and fallen, of the lessons I had learned. It was not artful, but it was honest. And in that honesty, I found a strange peace. My words were not for critics, not for historians, but for the soldiers who had marched with me, for the families who had sacrificed for the generations yet to come, who might ask what it had cost to save the Union. Even as I wrote, illness crept into my body. The doctors told me it was cancer of the throat, a cruel punishment for the cigars I had smoked so steadily through the years of war. Pain gnawed at me, swallowing became agony, and still I pressed forward. I knew I did not have long. I could not afford to falter. Every page I finished meant security for Julia. Every chapter meant dignity for my children. Every sentence was a step toward redeeming what fortune had stolen from me. I wrote as though the pen itself were a weapon, and time my relentless enemy. Visitors came to see me in those final months. Some spoke of battles long past, others of politics, still others of admiration. I listened politely but wasted no time. My strength ebbed daily, and I poured what remained into the memoir. Julia sat near me often, her quiet presence a comfort as it had always been. She knew the pain I endured, yet she never urged me to stop. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that this work was more than words. It was my last campaign, my final march, my closing duty. At last, near the end of July 1885, the work was complete. 2 volumes, thousands of pages, the story of my life set down in ink. I laid aside the pen, my hands trembling, my body weakened almost beyond recognition. A few days later, I breathed my last, leaving the world quietly, as I had lived much of it, without flourish or spectacle. The memoirs were published soon after, and to my astonishment they were hailed as a masterpiece. The critics who had once scorned me praised the clarity, the honesty, the insight. The public embraced them, buying thousands of copies, securing Julia's comfort and honoring my memory. I had fought many battles, but this one, the battle against time, against despair, against the silence of death, was the last I won, and it was perhaps the most enduring. In death, I was carried once more into the embrace of the nation. My funeral in New York drew millions, soldiers in blue and gray marching side by side, former enemies now united in respect. They called me a hero, a savior, a symbol of endurance. But I knew better. I was not brilliant, not eloquent, not flawless. I was simply a man who had been tested again and again, who had failed often, yet who endured. That was my strength, and that was my gift. They placed my body in a tomb that overlooked the Hudson River, a grand structure, solemn and proud. People still visit, still walk its steps, still speak my name. Yet I do not linger in stone. I live in the words I wrote, in the freedom preserved, in the union that survived. I live in the quiet endurance that carried me through failure and triumph alike. History will debate my presidency. It will measure my decisions. It will weigh my faults. But when it speaks of me, it cannot deny one truth: I never yielded. When the nation faltered, I stood. When the enemy pressed, I fought. When time itself tried to silence me, I wrote. And in every storm, I endured until the end. When I laid down the pen after finishing my memoirs, I felt a strange peace settle over me. For months I had fought against time and pain, each page written under the shadow of death. The cancer in my throat had silenced my voice, but it could not silence my will. I had marched through war, stumbled through failure, endured scandal, and borne the weight of a fractured nation. Now, in those final volumes, I had spoken my truth plainly as I had lived, without ornament, without flourish, but with honesty. I had given my family security, and I had given history my account. It was my last campaign, and I had won it. When death came in July of 1885, it came quietly. I left behind not riches but words, not monuments but endurance. The nation mourned me with a depth I had never expected. Soldiers in blue and gray marched side by side in my funeral procession, their old enmity laid to rest in honor of the man who had commanded one and respected the other. Crowds filled the streets of New York, millions strong, their voices hushed, their heads bowed. I, who had once been overlooked, who had once clerked in obscurity, who had once failed at every endeavor, was carried to rest as a hero. They built a tomb upon the banks of the Hudson, a grand structure rising above the river's flow. People came from every corner of the country to pay their respects, to stand in silence before the sarcophagus that bore my name. Some came in reverence, others in curiosity, but all came because they knew that my life had been woven into the story of the nation itself. That tomb still stands, a monument not to brilliance or eloquence, but to endurance. Why then was my face placed upon the $50 bill? Not because I was flawless, not because I was a perfect statesman, but because I was necessary. When the Union trembled on the edge of collapse, I stood and did not yield. When victory demanded persistence beyond imagination, I persisted. When corruption, scandal, and ruin threatened to erase me, I endured. The $50 bill does not honor triumph without flaw. It honors resilience, the kind that carries a people through darkness into light. I was not Washington, whose vision shaped the birth of the nation. I was not Jefferson, whose words stirred liberty into flame. I was not Lincoln, whose eloquence saved the soul of America. I was Grant, the quiet man who failed and failed, yet stood when it mattered most. I carried no gift for words, no taste for politics, no hunger for glory. I carried only the ability to endure, and in that endurance, I carried the Union to survival. My legacy is debated still. Some remember the scandals, the corruption, the depression of 1873. Others remember the victories, the surrender at Appomattox, the protection of freedmen, the honesty of my memoirs. Both are true. I was flawed, and I was steadfast. I stumbled, and I endured. That is what it means to be human, and that is what I leave behind. As the years pass, the noise fades, but the truth remains. The United States endured its greatest trial, and I endured with it. That is why my name remains, etched in marble, printed on currency, spoken in classrooms, remembered in silence at my tomb. Not as a man of brilliance, but as a man of persistence. When you hold that bill, when you see my face among the symbols of the nation, remember this. Greatness does not always shine. Sometimes it simply endures, steady and unyielding, until the storm has passed. And that, more than anything, is the story of my life.